Interesting. All right, stand by. And we are live. I believe. Hoping so. Jane, if you could in the background, please check to see if we are live on the Lowell Cultural Council website. Thank you. All right. Hello, my name is Bianca Morrow, and I've been on the Lowell Cultural Council since 2017. I would like to welcome you to the first of 4 webinars in our Inclusion 101 series entitled Inclusive Digital Space for the Well-Meaning, Well-Doing, and Well-Clueless. The topic for today's presentation is the community that the culture sector left behind before and during the COVID-19 pandemic. I feel like it would be cavalier and tone deaf of me to host a series on inclusion and not acknowledge what's happening right now. I don't want to take the spotlight off this important series, but I feel that it's equally important to acknowledge the greater context of social injustice in which this is taking place. Words matter and silence is deadly, but they are only words and actions matter more. This LCC series was created as part of our ongoing evolution to introduce diversity in new and meaningful ways. I acknowledge my privilege, and I do not have the felt experiences of those that are affected most by bigotry and marginalization. I will continue to educate myself and encourage you to do the same. Credible and trusted resources and members of our communities that need our advocacy and support the most. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to introduce Maxine Farkas, Chair of the Lowell Cultural Council, without which this would not have been possible. Hi, Maxine, and thank you.
Hello and welcome.
And our key presenter today and the author of this series, Carrie Thompson. Carrie has been a champion for the inclusion of people with disabilities in the arts and culture sector. As the Executive Director for Silent Rhythms, she has taught more than 5,000 people with disabilities how to dance and has taught countless more people without disabilities how to include people with disabilities in the arts and in our community through events such as Lowell and Boston's Salsa in the Park. She's joining us today to share her knowledge and expertise on how to make our community even more inclusive, especially during the pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us today, Carrie, and we are excited to learn from you.
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you, Bianca, and thank you to the Lowell Cultural Council for this amazing opportunity to share my background, expertise, and advice about how to be inclusive of people with disabilities. And the intent of this series is for the next 4 weeks to educate on the why and the how of including people with disabilities, especially now with 2 pandemics raging on, the COVID-19 and racial injustice. Today's session is really about focusing on the why and the what of including people with disabilities. The next 3 webinars will be about the how. So I'm going to ask for the slide projector to go to the next slide. This is a little bit about my background. I am the 2020 Harvard Dance Center visiting artist. Bianca has already mentioned my background as the Executive Director for Silent Rhythm. And I also have another hat as the Senior Officer of Communication, Inclusion, and Analytics for the Disability Rights Fund, where we work to advance human rights for people with disabilities in the Global South. The next slide, please. This is a picture showing me in a red dress. In front of me is a tactile sign language interpreter. As you can see, I am holding her hand. Behind me is another interpreter, and she is doing protactile on my back. Most people tend to not realize that I am deaf-blind. And right now, we all receive information in different ways. My way is very diverse. I receive information through touch. The person in front of me who is doing tactile sign language is telling me what people are saying. The person behind me is telling me what people are doing. On my back is a map, and she is showing me what people are doing, where they are they moving around, are they happy, are they sad, are they listening, or are they on their phone? So I know all, I have eyes everywhere. The pandemic has meant that my way of communicating through touch is no longer safe. My world has become even more darker and quiet than before. That's why I am doing this webinar, to teach you all how to not exclude me and the world's 1 billion people with disabilities from critical information, but also to include us when sharing information that is meant to educate, enlighten, and perhaps to even cheer up during these dark times. The next slide, please. This is an overview about today's session. Today's session is entitled "The Community, the Culture Sector Left Behind." We'll cover 5 areas. The first area is focusing on Inclusion 101, what that means. The second, it will be about what the American with Disabilities Act says. The third will be about what the challenges are facing people with disabilities and accessing their rights. The fourth will be about what are assistive devices and accessibility tools. The fifth will be how to create an inclusive and accessible community. So I want to point out that we will have time today at 10:45 where we will answer your questions. Well, I said we, but I meant me. I will be answering your questions, so if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I hope you find this session engaging and insightful. And I also hope that you are fascinated with everything I'm saying. Clearly, we are all deaf and blind on Zoom and not aware of what everyone else is doing and saying. So we're kind of all in the same boat. I also want to say that we will have future webinars. The next week will be focusing on creating inclusive and accessible social media. The following week will be on creating inclusive virtual spaces. And the last week will be on how to use captions and not claptions. So on with the show. Next slide, please. So this one is our topic on Inclusion 101. What is diversity and inclusion? Does it include disability? Diversity includes the broadest possible range of experiences, backgrounds, and perspectives, while inclusion means creating an environment where all people and ideas are valued. Yes, this should include disability, but often diversity and inclusion overlooks disability. Disability is a minority status. 15% of the world's population has a disability, making it one of the largest minority groups in the world. People with disabilities face discrimination, even from other minority groups, and experience a higher vulnerability to violence and abuse. As right now, our society has been distancing ourselves. The risk of abuse against people with disability has become even higher as they fall off the radar or because they are unable to escape their abuser. The next idea is about social model versus medical model. The social model is a philosophy that disability is not a diagnosis, but rather the result of social, physical, and digital barriers caused by society. The old view is the medical model is the belief that the disability is internal, that the problem is the person, not the environment, that disability is caused by the medical condition. So for example, what if I am in a room full of people who were deaf? My disability disappeared because most people in the room know sign language and we can communicate on an equal basis. But what if I'm in a room full of people who are hearing who do not know sign language? My disability has appeared. So the environment is the cause of my disability. In short, it's not me, it's you. So the other section is about inclusion and accessibility. People often use accessibility and inclusion to mean the same thing. They are not. Accessibility will mean having a sign language interpreter or having captioning. Inclusion is about bringing people to the table, having their say at the table, being able to talk to the person next to them, to have a conversation during the coffee break, and to go out to dinner and be invited to impromptu meeting. Another topic under Inclusion 101 is about the participatory approach. People hear this term and think this is about enabling a specific population to be part of their event, but it is more than about being seen. This is a small part of the participation approach. This approach means that people with disabilities are part of the decision-making process and that they have a say in how to be inclusive, as well as to have some thought about the general program. This approach means that they are part of the staff, they are part of the board, they are part of advisory committee. Sadly, in all of the various sectors, such as the nonprofit, healthcare, human rights, government, education, the arts sector is the worst offender of not hiring people with disabilities. Of course, there are some who are doing work for people with disabilities, but real change in society will only come if the work is of people with disabilities. My friend EJ is a deaf actor who has been advocating for leaders to be more inclusive and accessible, for audition, to make sure people with disability play the role of people with disability, but also to give people with disability the opportunity to play a role that is typically not someone with a disability. Inclusion needs to happen in the audience, on the stage, and behind the scenes. If your staff or board is all white people or all men talking about diversity, our sector would be outraged. But no one seems to be feeling the same outrage that people with disabilities are missing from the conversation. One more point about inclusion is intersectionality. A person with a disability can be a woman, a person of color, an indigenous person, an ethnic minority, or from the LGBTQI community. For this reason, it is important that all of these minority groups include people with disabilities as part of their focus. It's also important to remember that disability is the only minority group that anyone can join at any time in their lives. You may not have a disability today, but you might tomorrow. Next slide, please. The right to access the arts. We know that the arts has the power to change lives, create dialogue, and raise awareness of cultural differences. But did you know that access to the arts is a right? it is a civil right, it is a disability right, and it is a human right. This year is the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Making access to the arts a disability and civil rights issue, the Americans with Disabilities Act also meant access to information. Though the ADA was signed before we had the internet, emails, online platforms, and social media, the ADA does cover public space, and the Supreme Court and the Department of Justice considers online platforms like websites and social media and online meeting spaces like Zoom and websites to be public space. Access to the arts is not just a civil and disability rights, it is a human right. It is outlined in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights of 1948 and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The Declaration was created in 1948 at the end of World War II to serve as a global guideline to what it means by human rights and for whom. The Declaration was a roadmap for how to achieve peace while protecting the dignity of all people. And yes, the arts was included in this peace declaration. Article 27 says that everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community to enjoy the arts. Now, everyone is the single most important word of that statement. However, many countries, including the United States, seem to be confused what everyone means. Some believe that because a person has a disability, that they were not a human being or were second class or not a priority. Therefore, human rights does not apply to them. To address that stigma, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was entered into force in 2008. The CRPD says that people with disabilities should enjoy their human rights on an equal basis as people without disabilities. Once again, the topic of access to the arts came up in a human rights document. Article 30 of the convention says that people with disabilities should be able to participate in cultural life, recreation, and sports. Now, more than ever, it is important that all members of our society has access to the arts, all members. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that face people with disabilities, the first one is attitudinal. This can mean that people in society have a certain perception of people with disabilities about their capabilities or their interest or treatment as a second-class citizen. The second challenge is a physical challenge, and this means that perhaps the building is not accessible, that it does not include a ramp or an elevator or an accessible bathroom, or they do not have braille signs indicating where things are in the building. A third challenge is communication. Is the event accessible for those who are deaf or blind or hard of hearing, or those who are intellectual disability, or those that may be on the autism spectrum? Does the event include an interpreter, audio description, captioning, or sensory information for those on the autism spectrum? Another challenge is transportation. Is your event near a public transportation? Most people with disabilities, whether in the city or rural, do not have a car and rely on public transportation. So perhaps your event could be accessible at the event, but if you're not near public transportation, then it's difficult to get to your event. So you need to think about access, not just within, but getting to. Another challenge is financial and poverty. Often those with a disability are living in poverty. Disability can be a cycle. It can be that disability causes poverty, or poverty can cause disability, regardless of what causes which. The simple fact is that people with disability often cannot afford to attend a cultural event, to take a class. And right now, it is especially important to realize that as we shift to relying more on the digital space, not everyone has access to a computer and the internet. Next slide, please. Here are a couple of ways that we use accessibility tools. So some examples are a sign language interpreter, which is on this meeting platform. As you can see, you can pin the video of the interpreter if you would like to focus on the interpreter. Another form of tool is called Easy Read or Plain Language. We're trying to make the information as simple as possible for those with an intellectual disability. Screen readers. This is something that people do not realize, that all of you have accessibility tools at your fingertips. If you have an iPhone, an iMac, an iPad, or any Mac devices, accessibility tools are already built in to your phone. So there is a screen reader called VoiceOver, and you can play around with that feature to see how it works and what it's like for people using a screen reader. What does it sound like? The other is called a Braille display. First, I'm going to show you a few things. So if you want to focus on my video for one moment, first I'm showing you what Braille looks like. And now I'm going to show you what a Braille display is. A Braille display is something that people who are deafblind, or sometimes people who are blind, use. It's an electronic Braille. So if you saw a paper version of Braille, but it's not always possible to have a Braille paper copy of an email or to read an article that just popped up. This is a Braille display. At the bottom are the keys of Braille, so that when I connect this to my laptop and have it showing my notes, and then having it also connected to email, so I can read my email. And so all of these keys at the bottom are movable, and they constantly change to give me access to digital information. I'm not going to show you all these other tools. I am going to show you one more thing. I am using an iPad, and something just fell. Hopefully nothing too important that I need. So this is my iPad. It's showing you the caption. So for most people using the Zoom caption feature, it's difficult for me to see the caption in that small format, or sometimes I can't read as fast as the caption. So this same caption link is feeding the caption that you see on Zoom, but on this direct link, it's easier for me to see. I can adjust the size, the color, and everything else to suit my particular need. I'm not going to go on and on talking about all the different types of accessibility tools. You can see them here. So I do want to point out that there are a lot of apps out there that are really terrific. Many of them are free in terms of helping people with disabilities. There's one that's called Be My Eyes, which is when I connect to Be My Eyes, I'm connected to a volunteer, and I can show the volunteer my camera phone, and she will be able to look at the world around me and tell me what's in the room. Okay, so we're going to move on from accessibility tool to the next slide, which is on outreach tool. So this is about connecting to the disability community. There are several ways that organizations can communicate with the disability community. First, consider what you say. The message should be empowering. Use a person-first language, such as saying person with a disability rather than saying disabled person. Now, there are many different ways that people can communicate, and these are all ways that you already know. So as you see the different options, such as a newsletter, a webinar, a video conference, a survey, a vlog, which is a video blog, together is called vlog with a V, social media, and then chat, WhatsApp, and Messenger. Now, all of these, you need to consider several things. One, you need to make it accessible. Two, you cannot assume that people with disability have signed up for your newsletter or follow your social media page. So, in the old saying from the Field of Dreams movie, if you build it, they build it. You need to tell people with disability that you built it. Next, you need to do target outreach. So simply telling, you simply built the field of dreams, but now you have to try to get people with disability to know about this field of dreams. You need to do target outreach. Reach out to them on specific social media platform they follow. For Massachusetts, there's the Voice of the Deaf community on Facebook, or reach out to the organization of people with disabilities, such as Deaf Inc., or the Mass Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, or the Mass Rehabilitation Council Commission, and ask them about how the best way to reach out to certain population. What is the best tool? One of the most important things is access to the arts and culture is both a disability rights and a human rights issue, but often with people with disabilities are so focused on fighting for healthcare and employment and education that very few people fight for their right to access to the arts. Now, here is the door philosophy that I often use. People with disabilities have been met with a closed door or a door that has been slammed in their face. Now, people are trying to open the door, but you want to do is leave your door open, then come out and say, come on in. Now, I'm from Louisiana, and y'all, a welcome mat is probably the most important part of a Southerner's home. A lot of people spend a lot of time trying to select the perfect welcome mat. So I want you all to think about not just your door, but to think about your welcome mat. Next slide, please. So what is a video blog? I wanted to go back on one of the different ways to communicate. In this image, which is a screenshot of a YouTube video, a vlog. And this is from the Museum of Fine Art. That is an example of a well-doing approach. And here, this video is of two deaf people, including my friend, EJ, the actor. They are giving information about the Museum of Fine Art first ever ASL night. So not only does this video include two people who are deaf using sign language and also using caption, it's important to also point out that the Museum of Fine Art has often done a lot of events that they provided an ASL interpreter for, or have a tour that is led by a deaf docent in ASL. This particular event was about a night celebrating specifically the deaf culture, focusing on the deaf population. Next slide. So, examples of outreach effort. You already heard that this digital series is about focusing on digital space for the well-doing, the well-meaning, and the well-clueless. So I want to say that here is an example of a way that different organizations have advertised their event. The well-doing, they, in their advertisement, had included that their event will have live captioning or a sign language interpreter. The next way that somebody advertised their event is well-meaning. So in this one, the request for a sign language interpreter and or guide provider should be made at least 2 weeks in advance, if possible. And they say, please note that we will make every effort to secure services, but that services are subject to availability. That is almost a boilerplate language, and they're really trying to cover their behind if they don't come up with an interpreter. Now, while this may seem like a well-doing example, I actually downgrade it to well-meaning for several reasons. It's kind of saying the door is closed, but if you come up to the door and knock on it, we might open it for you. But that's not really very welcoming. Another problem with this is that this particular event that I borrowed this language from, they advertised their event 2 days prior to the event happening. So how am I supposed to put an interpreter request 2 weeks prior if you only told me about this event 2 days before? Now, the next category of outreach effort is the clueless. The clueless are those who didn't even bother to advertise their event as accessible or inclusive. They did not bother to give this option. And I'm going to give a little story from my own personal experience, that one of the reasons the Lowell Cultural Council is really near and dear to my heart is because they did an example of well-doing. Last year, they created an interpreter and accessibility fund to give all of their grantees an opportunity to provide funding for their event to have an interpreter and access. Now, at the same time this announcement had happened, one of Silent Rhythm donors had given Silent Rhythm a grant and had invited me to attend a large event where all of the grantees were invited to come together and share their work. I requested a sign language interpreter 2 months in advance. And I kept following up, and they said, we're working on it. We're working on it. The day before the event, I checked in one more time. Do you have an interpreter? And they said, no, we dropped the ball. And they said, we've never been asked before. So it was heartbreaking to have that happen to me, especially because they showcased my work on inclusion, but didn't include me. So next slide, please. I do want to go back to that point about what I just said of an organization that did not provide the interpreter for me. I am not part of a naming and shaming approach, so I'm not going to say the name of the organization, but I do want to say that they have made strides since then to do better. So I always believe in second chances, and really it's about educating and improving and doing better moving forward. This next slide is now switching a little bit more over on the technical side. I have a time check that is 10:36 or 10:38. It's really difficult for me to tell between 6 and 8. So I just wanted to point out the different ways of making a website accessible. So there are guidelines that you can go to follow for the website content accessibility guideline. You can visit that website that gives you more information about making your website accessible. I like the accessibility toolbar, and this is usually free. You can just include this as a plugin on your website. I like it because it gives you the option to make your font larger or to provide a contrast. I also like when they offer the option of Google languages, so that not everyone who is a person with a disability knows English. So you want to give them an opportunity to explore your information in a different language. I also want to say that you cannot assume that all people with disability knows how to use technology or is aware of all the technology out there. So many people with disabilities, like all of us, are trying to figure out Zoom and trying to figure out how to use social media and trying to figure out what Instagram is. So you can't assume that the information is already there planted in the person with a disability's mindset. So it's really a great approach to try to provide the information as much as possible. I also want to say that a lot of times our website is designed to be accessible. Your web developer made it accessible, but the web developer may not necessarily be the person that's editing the website. So it's really important that the information is shared with a web editor on how to make the website more accessible. So every time you upload an image to your website, you should be using describing images tool. You should be using the alternate text. And I'll talk more about alt text in next week's session, which is going to be about creating accessible and inclusive social media. I just wanted to bring this point up because website is one of the main ways that people share their information. So start thinking about whether or not your website is accessible, and then you can think about this some more and bring your question for next week so we can talk about this more. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm coming close towards the end. I wanted to say that I hope you all will be agents of change. We are currently going through a time of social and physical distancing. Isolation is not a new concept for people with disability, but I do not want us to experience a digital distancing because society does not know or does not think about how information should be inclusive of people with disability. You now know some ways to reduce the information barrier, and I hope you take the time to do a few extra steps. In doing so, you make my world a bit bigger. Inclusion only takes a little time, a little effort, a little money. Sometimes it doesn't even cost anything. So thank you. This was towards the end of my presentation. I really appreciate you listening to me, and I hope you enjoyed it. So I'll use this time now to look at my iPad to see the questions that you all have. Please feel free to add your question to the chat feature. Over to you, Bianca. Bianca, I see your lips moving, but I don't think you are.
Yeah, I don't know why it wasn't registering, but here we are. So thank you, Carrie. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Are you done with your slides, or would you like to leave them up for Q&A?
Go to the next slide, please, Kristen. I wanted to point out that there are several articles that I've written about inclusion, and here are several of the articles. I think we can leave this up. No, let's go to the next slide, which has my information about how to contact me if you have more questions. And I have all of these different social media platforms that I use. I don't use them all diligently, but I have them. Okay, thank you. Now back to you, Bianca.
Thank you. We actually only had, oh, here's one that's come in. So a question that came in earlier that I want to address first came in from Sam Gould asking if you would consider sharing your presentation with everyone who is registered. And so I told him that we could email out the PDF presentation to all the registered participants.
Great, thank you for that.
Go ahead.
I wanted to point out, it's not a question, but I also want to say that we'll talk about this a little bit later for accessible virtual meeting, but that shared screen share is not accessible for those with a screen share, with a screen reader. And a PowerPoint provided ahead of time is one way to help make your event a little bit more accessible. A PowerPoint is accessible via screen reader, and the PowerPoint that I have also includes the alt text to the images that I've included.
Perfect. So we will respond to that directly by sending out next week's PowerPoint to all registered participants 1 hour before the webinar.
Great.
Thank you, because I had no idea and I really appreciate that. The next question we have in the Q&A is from Betsy. Betsy asks, can you give us another example or two of well-doing practices?
Yes, I can. So many of you probably know Wheelock Family Leader, and Wheelock Family Leader for the last 20 years has been providing captioning for every single show that they offer at the theater, not just one show, but every night of that show. And they often provide American Sign Language interpreter for one or two shows for one particular show. And Wheelock has been doing something, has been way ahead of the game for decades in providing access and inclusion for people with disabilities. Broadway in Boston, such as like the Opera House, the Colonial Theater and the Wing Theater, many of them offer one show that will have open caption and one show that has American Sign Language. And those are great. That's more an example of well-meaning. Why is I say it's well-meaning rather than well-doing is a little bit limiting, because what if you're not able to attend that one night of when they are offering ASL? Wheelock Family Leader, with every show having a caption option, it means that I can go any night that I want. I also want to go back to another example of well-doing that the Wheelock Family Leader did. I don't know if you know this, but I was Angel Mama in the production Pippin Longstocking. I don't consider myself an actress. I do consider myself a dancer. And Wheelock Family Leader was looking to have the part of Angel Mama played by a deaf dancer. So they were looking around to find a deaf dancer, and they approached me, and I said, well, I am a deaf dancer, but I'm also a dancer who is visually impaired, so I'm a deaf blind dancer. And they thought, oh, well, let's see how we can make this work. And they were terrific. There was something that I was nervous about trying to navigate the stage, especially with all the different stage props. I didn't know how to feel my way across the stage, and my entrance had to come in one way and had to go to the other side of the stage. How I came in on the stage, my entrance was to come in on the music. They had a moon in the background because I was supposed to come to Pippi in a dream at nighttime. What they did was they took a piece of rope, attached it to the moon, and had the moon moving across the stage. While I held on to a rope, the moon moved me partly to the stage to where I had to sing. I tied the rope off to the side of Pippi's house. Pippi came down and she met me, and together she and I danced on the stage. And then we also had to figure out a way for me to get off the stage without Pippi having to guide me off. What she says in her dream, she says, I miss Papa. So Papa Longstocking comes from the other side and he joins us dancing together. And then Papa Longstocking and I dance together, and he's guiding me off the stage as we're dancing. So, oh, I just gave myself goosebumps. As an example of really well doing approach.
That's great. Thank you so much, Carrie. And thank you, Betsy, for that question. Does anyone else have any questions that you would like to ask Carrie? Please put them in the chat or the Q&A. Well, I didn't think we'd get to wrap up early today, Carrie, and give you back 12 minutes of your day, but we sincerely appreciate you joining us today, and I'm really excited for what the next 3 weeks of this series brings. Again, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Rachel. And in the background, we still have Christian from the City of Lowell, who's the admin for the Lowell Cultural Council, working diligently on the slide deck. Jane Long from BRM Production Management, who works with me. And our closed captioner, who has been providing the closed captions throughout all of this. And of course, Maxine Farkas, Chair of the Lowell Cultural Council. Rachel, for providing the ASL. Thank you so much. Everyone, have a wonderful rest of your Friday, and we will see you next week at 10 a.m. for the next in our series of Inclusion 101 entitled Accessible Social Media and Inclusive Instagram. Thanks again, and have a wonderful weekend.